Welcome, and thank you for joining us for a new Ask the Pet Food Pro chat. This series is brought to you by Pet Food Forum and the editors of Pet Food Industry, the magazine and digital content provider with decades of providing the market with pet food expertise. You can find our content at petfoodindustry.com. Ask the Pet Food Pro is a great opportunity to connect with an industry expert and ask the questions that are most on your mind while learning information to help you and your company provide high quality pet food and treats. Today's chat is about dealing with supply chain challenges related to pet food ingredients and how they affect processing. It's supported by Coperion, so thanks very much to them. And our expert today is Drew Turner, Regional Sales Manager for Coperion's food industry market. Welcome, Drew, and thank you for joining us today.
Hello, how are you doing today?
Great. Before we start the Q&A and discussion, I have a few quick housekeeping notes. First, you've all been muted to ensure everyone can hear and focus on the discussion. So please submit your questions or comments in the chat box. And some of you submitted questions beforehand, which we really appreciate. And we will try to get to as many of those as we can, along with the ones submitted today. And finally, this chat is being recorded. You can access the recording starting in about a week at petfoodforumevents.com, and then click on the Ask the Pro tab at the top. Okay, so with that, let's get into the discussion. So Drew, let's first just kind of set the stage a little bit. Can you please share some of the concerns and challenges you've been hearing from some of your customers regarding supply chain disruptions, especially related to ingredients?
Yeah, biggest thing I've basically been seeing is the fact of the cost of ingredients at this point in time and the availability of those ingredients. Everything's been getting kind of crazy as far as people actually being able to find the materials they're looking for and looking at different materials that could potentially fill the need and give still the actual information they need, and also to make sure the recipe still stays on track.
Right. So, and we had a question come in about the rising freight prices, especially related to those things coming from imported ingredients. I'm getting an echo from someone. Okay, so is that a factor too? So the rising prices of freight cost are impacting the cost of ingredients, especially imported ones. I mean, is that a factor too?
Yes, it is. You do have people starting to look at different ingredients that could potentially fill the need, and or really starting to look at accuracy as being a really good requirement. You start looking at what is the cost of adding an ingredient in. If you overfeed a little bit of that more expensive material, or the material you're finding difficult to procure, that starts to become very valuable.
So you're saying in terms of accuracy, your formulations have to be really on target.
Yeah, and it's not even so, it's even above that. Your accuracy has to be basically meeting the recipe. Let's say, if you're looking at plus or minus 1% of an ingredient versus plus or minus 0.5%, the cost to make that goes up rather significantly, rather quick, per hour, per batch, and so forth.
Understood. So, obviously that means that people that companies are having to substitute ingredients. What are the steps to make that happen in a as smoothly and painlessly and cost efficiently as possible?
Yeah, no worries. One of the first things we basically always recommend is for a customer to reach out to who supplied the system or who helped install the system, is just to see if they will be willing to offer any kind of testing to validate if the piece of equipment they have will work with the new ingredient and or the changes in the recipe. So that way you can have a conversation with them, the experts, make sure it's done right, and so forth. The next will be to actually test it yourself if you have the capability, if you have a one-off piece that you can actually run the material with and start to validate the process with the new ingredient. But there is a lot of challenges changing the ingredients. Sorry.
Right. Okay. Sorry to interrupt. So I mean, what are some of those challenges? I imagine people who are logged in are experiencing them themselves, but maybe if you can run down a few of them, the more prevalent ones.
Yeah, no problem. The biggest thing you see, even if a customer, let's say just for sugar, because everyone kind of knows that, changing from one brand of sugar to another could be a very significant change, whether it be the particle distribution, how granular the product is. Most of the time it won't affect your system. However, sometimes it will, depending on what you need to do to your system to allow that material to move through the process to get from point A to point B. You know, a lot of things we do, or a lot of system suppliers will either vibrate a bin and or inject it with air to get the material to flow through the system. However, when you have a gravimetric feeder below, once you start to vibrate it, you have to make sure the vibration does not impact your feeder below and or whatever device you have actually. And or once you start ingesting air into the system, it starts to change your bulk density of that material because you're adding air between the molecules and the particles.
Yeah, as we all know, pet food is a very complex thing to produce, to create and produce. So as you were saying, any minor little, even what seems like a minor change in ingredients can have a lot of impact. What about procuring equipment itself? That's that's one thing that Coperion provides. Are the freight, supply chain issues, things like that, are they affecting the ability for people to buy new equipment or to get it installed on time?
Yeah, and it's been rather significant. You're probably increasing, and it's from everything from getting the metal to make the part yourself, all the way down to sensors, PLC boards in the motors. They've been rather significant impacts.
Okay, so for example, like semiconductor chips, like that, we've been hearing that for over 2 years, that those have been a problem for every industry. I'm assuming that's affecting pet food too.
Yeah, and it's kind of weird sometimes when we look at some of the numbers, just to kind of put a couple examples out there. I won't, no names or anything like that. But when you buy something, you just don't, you're getting a very fluid date. And where before you used to know we can get something in 10 weeks. Now it's 10 weeks, and as it gets closer, it starts to move on you.
Mm.
Yeah, and we always try to do our best to keep ahead of that curve, but you can't account for it all.
Sure. And then in the one thing that's been sort of encouraging in the last couple of years, despite the pandemic and the resulting economic problems and now the supply chain problems, is pet food keeps growing and a lot of facilities keep opening and expanding. But I'm assuming all of these issues that we're talking about can impact that too. When facilities are supposed to open, when expansions are supposed to start to take place.
Yeah, I mean, if you take a look at it, what they're looking at, you start looking at your cost for labor, and then you look at what's the capital cost for equipment, and you start to become, you get closer and closer to that flatline point where it may be worthwhile to look at bringing in new equipment, because maybe, you don't have enough, you can't get enough, employees to come in and run the line for you. You may look to automate it. And how do you automate it accurately? The one nice thing is when you have a person dumping in, they actually, it's still a human error potential portion of it, but it's a lot easier to pick a bucket up and dump it into something versus make sure potentially pneumatic convey it or mechanically convey something over and then run it through a rotary valve and or a screw feeder. You do have some maintenance on that equipment. I guess it's similar to maintenance as with employees, keep employees still working for you.
Yes. The employment situation is huge too. So have you seen from among any of your customers, as they're having to substitute different ingredients, for example, is the labor shortage impacting that? For example, are they losing people with the experience to know how to make that happen correctly? Or
I haven't noticed that. However, I will say, you may have newer people to the market which may come to you and look at you as being the expert and say, hey, this is what we want to do. We don't do it this way now. How do you recommend we do that? And the whole changing of ingredients, it's gotten a lot worse because of the pandemic and some of the supply chain issues we're running into. But there is several customers, that will always come to you with, what is the trendy new material that has to go into a pet food? Does it need to look a different color? Does it have to have a different flavor or taste? So I think they're always messing with the recipes and changing those.
Well, true. That's true. I mean, it's a very dynamic industry, and a big part of that is new product development and product changes, and staying ahead of the next big trend. So that's a good segue, because we've had several questions about ingredient trends. But before we get to that, we did have one just come in about, so what are some of the common ingredients that you're seeing now that you think will have shortages in the future? Either they're starting to show signs of it now, or you can just, maybe put on your crystal ball and.
I don't know, honestly.
Okay.
It's I know there was a big push for wheat, but there's not a whole lot of wheat really being put in dog food, but the price of that just went astronomical, where it's, a weekly change.
Okay. Right. Probably partially too because of the war in
Correct.
Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah, they're a number one supplier.
Right. Well, so what about some specific ingredient trends? You mentioned that, a lot of the companies will just try to stay ahead of that and substitute ingredients even without supply chain issues. What are some of the trends you're seeing happening in terms of new ingredients?
I think the one thing I've noticed is, with the FDA and different regulations, I think it's being monitored a lot closer, trying to get rid of certain minerals that are in pet food that maybe aren't looked at as highly as they used to be. And they're now looking at different ingredients, more organic choices.
Right. Okay. So regulations always play, not just marketing and consumer trends, but regulations play a big part. And
I think also, I think it might come down to veterinarians, given, a potentially dietary requirement change. They may say that, hey, in an older dog, this may not be so good to have that product in there. We recommend you change it to this. I think that's some of the R&D stuff that's always going to continue to go on.
Sure.
And some of those materials are easy to flow and move around, and other ones could be really challenging.
Right. And I mean, of course, we can always look back to the whole DCM situation and how that, made a lot of companies scramble to come up with grain inclusive formulations. And, was that maybe a precursor to what we're experiencing now, or just a kind of a one-off thing?
I think it may be a one-off thing in reality. That's my opinion.
Okay.
I mean, but I think some of the times when you do see a one-off, people will start to look at that a little closer and see if there's more going on there than thought.
Right. Or just maybe it helped people prepare for the idea of having to substitute ingredients or change formulations more quickly than they might normally do.
Correct.
So. Okay.
And, that whole concept there becomes interesting because there's a whole traceability point of view as well, which becomes a very, very big topic. But just from that point of view of, barcode scanning of the actual ingredient going into the process, tracking that through, reporting it out. So you have a report for each. Let's say if you were doing a batch process, you'd have a report for that batch. And when you cross lots and so forth, you have actually making sure that all that reporting is proper and can give you the information if something does happen.
Right. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because we did have a question submitted beforehand about traceability. And as Drew alluded, that's, could be a whole chat in itself. But, there are tools out there, as he was just describing, with barcodes to help with that. So getting back to some of the ingredient trends, one question we had come in just now is how are vegetables looked at as an ingredient source in the future, and which ones are favored? And I think that might be, the person might be alluding to in terms of the supply available and as well as trends.
I haven't seen much changes there. Yeah, I will say you do start to see, we have seen more wet pet food opportunities, a lot more wet pet food, I guess, what we'll call the premium foods versus your, I'm going to go based on what I'm just seeing. But when you go into a store, there seems to be a lot more choices for wet premium food, I'll call it, versus your traditional kibble and adding things to a kibble.
Right. Yeah. And I think the market data bears that out, that wet pet food's been growing more quickly than dry food for the last couple of years. What about alternative plant-based proteins like potato, pumpkin seed, legumes, pea or fava beans? I mean, are you seeing more of those being used, and are those supply chains being impacted too?
Since how do I say this? We do offer an option. Extrusion starts to become an option. Looking at doing, we'll say a plant-based protein in order to handle that. However, I personally, I think at this point in time, the cost is higher at this point. It may get closer as we go on down this path, but at this point in time, I think the cost to go with a plant-based protein may be a little bit higher than a benefit at this time. And as we see these continued increases and availability goes down, it may get a lot closer.
This is true. They might start to reach a market parity, if you will.
Yeah. At some point in time, you're going to get closer and closer. That gap is going to get closed.
Are protein, traditional animal protein supplies being affected? I mean, I know in the human food market, we're hearing, like chicken's getting more expensive, eggs are getting more expensive, turkey, there's a shortage of turkey. A lot of that's being impacted by the avian influenza outbreaks. Is that showing up in pet food too?
I haven't personally seen it, but then again, I haven't really asked. I just know, you're always putting some kind of, protein meal as one of your bases. I think there's always a source of it, but it does bring up a thing that, didn't really think of that.
Yeah, probably something we all need to watch. When you mentioned before the FDA cracking down, for example, on certain minerals and, people going to organic substitutes instead, someone asked if organic choices in general are more, I think he wanted clarification on that. He or she wanted clarification on that particular point of the example you were giving, where some minerals are going out of favor with FDA and people are opting for organic options. Is that's not a blanket response, right? It's just maybe in those specific cases.
I just pointed out one I know, for a fact that, when things do become an issue, it gets down to, I think we touched on it the other day a little bit as well. TI2 has become unfavorable in the European markets. They're looking to go for an alternative there. As things like that come up, we're always looking for a different choice. And obviously the organic choice is typically going to be your best option. And I would think more acceptable from the FDA.
Gotcha.
Now, that's my assumption there, but.
Okay. Understood. And by the way, TIT is titanium oxide, or is it dioxide?
Dioxide.
Sorry, that would be two parts. Sorry. Titanium dioxide. So for anyone on the call who's not familiar, that is a common coloring additive, and it's not being allowed, or it's going out of favor in the EU. So there's been a lot of substitution talk about that too. In terms of some of the shortages that we're seeing, back to the original topic, have you seen, is it impacting dog food more than cat food? Is it about equal? Does it just depend on the type of food, regardless of the species?
On the type of food and the ingredient. It's becoming less readily available, and as you become less readily available, the cost is going to go up, right? As supply goes down, demand goes up, so, and cost as well. So it's the cost of adding that ingredient now, and you start to look, do we really need that ingredient, or do we start looking at an alternative?
Gotcha. Have you seen any particular unique changes that customers have made to their ingredient supply chain? Anything, really creative to get around some of these issues, or that is not the norm for how to respond to them?
I guess the only thing I could kind of say is I think there's a couple processes where they're looking at more of a continuous versus large batches to be able to handle changes.
Okay. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, please? Just for people who may not be as familiar with the different processes.
Yeah. So let's say instead of using a traditional where you would have several feeders feeding into a large hopper that may be on load cells, and you go ahead and do your process that way, versus actually having a load cell at the individual feeder feeding in. So actually monitoring each individual feeder, each ingredient, versus doing the process as one feeder at a time going into a weighed hopper.
Ah, okay.
So actually monitoring each ingredient going into the processes versus trying to do a very gross weighing of each ingredient going in. And the big complication there is time. When you're putting each ingredient in that way, you have to do them one at a time, versus if you have the scale at the feeder, you can do them all multiple at the same time.
Understood. And then I'm assuming that the time, then the whole labor situation enters in again.
Yeah, and also your flexibility, because you're adding each ingredient in, you can slightly fine tune each ingredient versus trying to do a whole batch first.
Right. Okay. So people are still wanting you to put on your crystal ball and ask about newer emerging ingredients. Maybe in your role, are you able to foresee things that maybe coming down the pike that no one had thought about yet, or
I definitely think, like I said before, the plant-based protein is something being identified and looked at closely. But I do think right now, and this is just what I'm looking at, what I'm thinking, and how you see the energy that it takes potentially to make a plant-based protein. I think the cost is a little too high right now. But if I were to take a look, that's probably, we're doing plant-based protein for humans. I'm sure not too far along, all of a sudden, we're going to start to really want to look at that closely.
What about insect protein? Are you getting questions, or, obviously they're just now starting to gain some approval in the US for full diets, in dogs at least. Are you seeing more companies using that? And are there any processing challenges or unique ways that they need to be processed, or?
I have not seen that at all. That's new to me.
Okay. Okay.
There is, I have seen mushrooms, looking at that as a source of protein.
The fungi,
go that way, but then there's a whole cost of developing the fungi and so forth. But, the cost to raise fungi may be a lot cheaper.
Could be. Insect protein is getting a lot of hype now, but it's not at scale by any means. So.
And I just have it, and that's actually new. I'm actually curious. I'll do some research on that, about the insect protein.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mentioned I was at Interzoo before the meeting. I was at Interzoo in Germany a couple of weeks ago, and because insects have been approved for far longer in Europe, there were tons. Just not tons, but a lot more insect protein-based diets and new ones coming on the market than what we're seeing here, which I think here we're seeing a lot more. And there's a lot of talk. I've heard different experts, speculate, well, still, will it ever reach scale? And, will it ever, by the time that it could reach scale or get to where, in the Western world, we get over the quote unquote yuck factor idea. Will it ever really take off? Who knows? But this is not necessarily a chat about insect protein, so we won't delve too much into that. But
it follows suit, though, a different ingredient. That would be an interesting how you would make that, I guess, and how you would turn that into volume of some kind of densified product with a high density for protein.
Yeah, I think most suppliers are using meals. You can have it made into a meal or an oil. But yeah, I'm sure that as they become more common, that there will be some processing situations that come up. Okay, we talked somewhat about some of the steps that people need to take. What other things are that you're seeing from clients that, people may not be thinking about?
Sometimes, and I'll go back to my sugar example. Try not to just look at an ingredient as one ingredient swap for another. So if you're looking to change an ingredient, what's the density look like? What's the product distribution? Does it have the same granularity? And how's that going to mix in the processes? How are you going to go ahead and be able to feed that in? But just when you look, because you're starting to look at how many grams potentially are you feeding per second? And you want to make that as consistent as you possibly can to keep the flowability.
Okay. And I'm assuming that, the larger companies would have this expertise within their teams and their companies to be able to do this. What about smaller companies? Where can they turn to help them? You mentioned earlier that, to for example, to contact their equipment providers.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Any other suggestions for that?
That's usually the easiest. There's quite a few of us out here that will do free testing. If you just contact a local rep and or contact the company through a web page, and you say, hey, I got this ingredient, I'm looking to potentially change. Here's where I'm at now. Here's where I'm looking to go. What would you recommend? And we would do a test for that and give you the accurate results and what kind of accuracy you can expect and so forth. Because it's hard to get a hold of a piece of equipment, just to do a checkout and be able to, this as a supplier, I have a lot more at my hands, my disposal. So if one option doesn't work that I actually thought first, I may be able to change it out and see the benefit of one versus the other. And you can offer that, potentially to the customer going forward. If we stay with what you have, here's the limitations. However, you look to change, this may be the benefits.
Okay. Are you, as a supplier, you said you have a lot more at your disposal, but are you also seeing some of these, having some of these challenges yourself, I'm assuming?
You're always going to. Even when I do a test in the test lab and I re-verify a process, once you put it in the actual process, in the environment, things will change on you. And you're trying to make sure you capture everything you can. I'm not looking at, when we do a test here, I may not looking at, my upstream devices, or it may change, from when you first start it to where it actually gets installed. So how does that impact the feeder? You start getting into venting the feeder properly, allowing it to breathe, to make sure material flows through it like it should. Even if you have a rotary valve, same thing. A feeding device at the end of the day is taking material and moving it. But however, you got to keep in mind that you're displacing air as you move the material. So if I take material from one spot and put it to another, I've displaced that same amount of air to basically account for that volume I've added. So the system has to breathe to be able to feed properly and make sure material flows properly. And it's funny because it goes back and forth. You have to be able to, in reality, the system has to be able to breathe in and out. As material comes in, it's got to breathe out. And as it's discharging out, it has to be able to breathe in. So it's a constant balance there. We kind of always look at it as being, balancing your pressure or your actual situation you have and balancing that out.
That makes a lot of sense. And just again, speaks to the complexity of making things like pet food. This is an interesting question that just came in. We hear a lot about the Internet of Things, and you have mentioned several times automation, which feeds into that, obviously. Are there any IoT applications today that can help with some of the supply chain challenges?
You think about that a second.
Take your time.
I don't know if there's any IoT that could help, let's say, with that challenge. However, I do think in systems, there is benefits to looking at that. Because I did mention, making sure your system is balanced as far as the venting of it. If you were to have sensors incoming and outcoming of devices, you'd be able to track that and see trends.
Yes.
And how that, how potentially you'll be able to find out rather quickly if a lot that came from supplier Y behaved differently in your system. And then maybe, if you did have perfect barcoding, you'd be able to track it back and say, hey, we got to go back to that potential vendor or supplier of the material and have a discussion with them. Why did it change?
So as these challenges are coming up and people are having to adapt to them, IoT can possibly help with making sure that the changes are working.
Correct. Make sure make sure nothing bad is happening, unfortunately.
Yes.
You always have the issue of, you may not get all material. Something could have fell into the bag. Make sure that comes out of it, but being able to track that. So there is, I guess, as I say it, there is potentially some IoT things there, but a lot of that comes down to sensors and external devices and how that will be implemented into the system and the overall control of it.
Right. Okay. And, so IoT wouldn't be a savior right now. It would be another tool. It sounds like, yeah. I think we had someone join late who was asking about, whether you're having to help substitute meat only or other ingredients. I think we've sort of skirted around this, but what are and I think I even asked this, what are the most common ingredients that are, you mentioned wheat, but are there other ones that, is it mainly grains? I'm hearing in the human food industry that oils are becoming a big problem because of the war in Ukraine. Meat, you said, was not necessarily an issue for your customers right now, but is it cereals? Is it grains? Is it all over the place?
In reality, I think it's everything. The cost to make stuff went up significantly.
Right.
You mentioned oil. Well, the cost for energy, the cost for gases went up so significantly as well. The cost just naturally goes up. The cost for labor went up, and being able to, find labor, and potentially having to overpay for labor now.
Yes.
That is potentially driving up the cost of ingredients exponentially. It's not flat by any means.
So in other words, it's not always a supply chain challenge in terms of not being able to get it. It's just the fact that the costs are just, so out of control now.
Yeah. And I think everything, it's I'll call it like the perfect storm. It's kind of everything compounding on it.
Right. And when I was mentioning oil, I was actually, mentioning like food oils, like, sunflower oil, but yeah, you're right. But energy is huge. It's a huge issue right now. We're all paying $5 a gallon for gas. Mm-hmm. So that's just one symptom of it. When you mentioned before the things that some manufacturers are doing, like batching changes to deal with some of these supply chain challenges, are you seeing your partners doing a lot of capital improvements, as a direct result of these supply chain issues, especially in terms of how they receive and process ingredients?
I think they're looking at it a lot closer than they have in the past. I think there's a more evaluation going and looking at the way the process is now and what's the benefit potentially going to a different process or upgrading a process, let's say.
Okay. And are those, so is that both from an equipment aspect and or automation?
It's all of the above.
Okay.
If you start to see that you're having challenges with, let's say manpower, you potentially look to automate that process, and what's the cost to automate it? And you start to balance it out and say, is this something we may would look to be a little bit more consistent by doing automation? However, you're doing a cause and effect. You're going to have some benefit, but how do you make sure you don't have some negatives as well? We're minimizing those.
Right. So we've had some other questions come in while we've been talking about some of the equipment processing things, about ingredients again. And you've mentioned the organic alternatives in terms of minerals. What about organic meat? Do you think is that something that you hear about or see in your role as being more on the horizon, being looked at more?
I have to think, that's not something I personally follow, but I know that, there is some looking into it. It's just going to be which one is going to win, I guess. You have what, pea protein, you got mung bean, like I said before, you start having mushroom. But at the end of the day, I do think the biggest challenge that maybe have to look at is how do you densify that product and remove as much water as you can to make sure you pack enough protein in, right? You're gonna have to make sure you can do a one-off swap here, or even be more dense and actually a higher quality or higher, grams of protein.
Right. And in this case, the person was actually talking about actual meat, like organic, like, he mentions pork meat. I guess my assumption would be that that's always been too cost prohibitive, but as you mentioned with the plant-based alternatives, maybe that will start to reach parity because everything else is getting so expensive. I don't know if you have any experience with organic meats.
Not as far as pork. I'm not familiar with pork.
Okay.
I know they're looking at all different organic options for different types of protein, whether it be seafood, not, meat, beef, and making sure you get the right texture. A taste in reality is just, adding the right flavorings to it, but trying to get the right texture and make sure it gives people that look. I don't want to be rude. I don't know if a dog necessarily is concerned about a texture of something they eat. Maybe they are.
I don't think that's rude.
I'm
think
not
that's
the
just
expert in there,
I don't think that's rude. I think that's just, basic dog physiology and behavior. And someone asked, and I think again, there's someone who joined a little bit later who's asking if plant-based protein is more expensive than animals. Yes, you said, but that it could, and that's probably been an issue in terms of being adopted more. But as everything else goes up in price, those may become more attractive. Mentioning, talking about the meat supplying though, someone's asking, do you think that there's a trend or opportunity for smaller companies or startup ingredient suppliers, for example, in fresh or frozen meats, because the big suppliers might be facing more shortages?
I do think you see that. I see different companies on the market, that come to us that may not have spoke to us in the past because they weren't even looking at these kind of processes going forward, and they're starting to now look at it. However, I think you do run into, some of the smaller ones. There's a cost to get into the market,
right?
To become a player. So I think it's a balance. You have to have funding is the first thing.
Right. And, it probably is related to the same thing as organic or alternative, plant-based is the whole trend in consumer demand for more locally sourced ingredients that would seem to be an opportunity for smaller suppliers, but the cost has always been higher and it probably will just have to reach more of a parity level.
Unless they have, I'll call it, if they have the special sauce, it's the kind of, if you have that and you get the market first before someone else, you basically won that shelf space.
Yes. And special sauce is always going to be important in the pet food industry. We had a question. Let me see if I can find that. This is more of a general trend question that, I probably just want to know based on your experience. Are there any specific health benefits being targeted or marketed in the industry that you're noticing that are new or different?
I don't believe so at this point. I can't see a trend. Outside of, being directed to try and remove certain things from the recipe they have now based upon seeing directives coming forth.
Okay. I think that you're always going to see the hot new ingredients from the human food industry, waking their way into pet food. For example, I've heard, I didn't go to Global Pet Expo, but I heard that collagen was much more prevalent in treats and supplements there, and which is, popular in people. So you can imagine that now people, that companies looking for pet food. I don't know if there's any research on it. Probably not. So yeah, I mean, I think that probably the answer to that question is, follow the human food trends, and you can follow the pet food trends.
Yeah, and some of the time I may not even, as being a supplier, I may not go down to that level. I may,
right.
It may be, let's just say I'm adding, one of our locations or one of our stations, I'll say, is adding in, a vitamin premix or a vitamin mix. And all of a sudden, they start to add that collagen as part of that. I wouldn't necessarily see that change because I would assume it'd be a very small amount.
Sure. Yes. And if it's, I don't know if many of your customers do treats or supplements, but I think that's where it's mainly happening now, is more on the treat side.
Yeah, we do the treats as well.
I'm assuming that because treats, they're not, the formulation is not as big a deal, or doesn't have to follow the same kinds of AFCO and other regulations. Are they being able to be more flexible in terms of ingredient substitutions, do you think? Treat manufacturers?
Based upon what I see, on the applications I'm familiar with, it's a lot less ingredients, 3-4 ingredients versus, 30 potential ingredients.
And okay, but they should, but I guess my question was, yeah, they should be able to make the substitutions easier and without having to go through as many, even testing, because the processing probably isn't as complex. I'm guessing.
At the end of the day, I think it's all complex. The ones that I'm familiar with we're extruding treats out. But I guess you're getting, you do get significant data back, and you can do an analysis on that as well, versus trying to add potentially 30 ingredients to verify the process is working. Right.
I mean, and I'm assuming that the trick of balancing the formulation isn't, I mean, it wouldn't be nearly as tricky and complex as a full diet. I think, unless, if anyone else has any questions, please add them in here. But it seems is there anything we haven't covered, Drew, that you were hoping we would, that you were, wanting people, I guess, is there a parting shot, a parting message that, you hope people can take away from the discussion today? I'm kind of putting you on the spot again. Sorry,
no, that's fine. Don't worry about it. I'm just trying to make sure I'm looking at some of the things that I had written earlier. The only thing I always kind of say is don't underestimate making a change to a material. Always reach out to whoever you can, and if you can't get if you can't get a hold of someone, maybe look at an alternate supplier if you're not getting the feedback you need. Okay. Just to make sure, someone should be able to help you with their equipment on how the process works and start to help you understand.
Okay. Does a company like Coperion, can you also help make connections to ingredient suppliers? Is that part of what you provide, or?
Typically, we typically work with both. It's not that we couldn't, but it's typically not someplace where we step in to help.
Okay. Just curious.
Yeah.
So it sounds to me like the summary is, keep a very close eye on things as much as you can in terms of your ingredient supplies, and don't hesitate to reach out to your suppliers, including your equipment suppliers, to help you anticipate possible changes and what they need to do to make a change.
Yeah, and I would also say, if you're putting, if you're looking to put a new system in, putting some extra sensors in to keep an eye on the process, and that way you can potentially optimize that process along the way and be able to adapt
more quickly, because you would have that data. Is
yes.
What you were saying.
And what you do with the data, at least you have it. I always kind of say it's better to have the data, and be able to analyze it and see what's going on versus not have it and have to add it. Because, adding it into a control system can be very challenging afterwards.
Yeah, I would imagine. Okay, well, I think that probably wraps up the discussion. Thanks very much, Drew, for your insights and expertise today. Thanks again to Coperion for your support. To learn about other pet food industry topics, please watch for more Ask the Pet Food Pro Chats we have coming throughout the year. We will also have webinars that we do. You can watch petfoodindustry.com for announcements of those. We'd also like you encouraged to please save the date for next year's Pet Food Forum, which will include sessions on topics like this. And finally, we would greatly appreciate your feedback on today's chat to help us improve future ones. You can either scan the QR code that's on your screen now or respond to a survey email you'll be receiving soon. So with that, thank you all again for joining in. One more reminder that the recording of this will be available in about a week on petfoodforumevents.com under the Ask the Pro tab. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day or evening.
Thank you very much.